Hi, today we will talk about intentional torts and criminal acts. So, in order to do that, I will introduce the two principles and we will see what the differences are. And then I will talk only about assault and battery and defamation. I will focus only on those 2 points. So, first thing, what's the difference between an intentional tort and a criminal act? In order to do that, you need to understand that a tort is a negligence or an intentional tort. Obviously, the difference between the two is the intention, okay? Those are not criminal matters, okay? So they obey to the civil codes. The most common intentional torts are assault, battery, and defamation in sport, so that's why we will focus on these three. So first, how to prove an intentional tort? You have to show that there was an intent to bring about the injury. Otherwise, as we learned before, it would be a negligence. Then the act is the proximate cause of the injury, and then, of course, that there was an injury. On the other hand, the criminal act is an unlawful action and evil action. You will usually see those two concepts, which are actus reus. That's a bad act, translation from the Latin. It means that a criminal act has been committed, needs to be proven. Second thing which needs to be proven is that there was mens rea, that means a guilty mind. The person intentionally, knowingly, recklessly and grossly acted to hurt somebody else. The most common crimes in sport are assault, battery and corruption. Okay, assault and battery, as you can see, are also the most common intentional torts in sport. That's why we will focus on that especially. Now, with an intentional tort, you're gonna use the civil court. The goal is to compensate the wronged party, so you have a potential reward for the wrong party. But the goal of a criminal court is very different. It's to free society from harmful conduct. Okay, so the reward there is public health, safety, moral, and welfare. Okay, that's what is the reward there, which means no monetary damage. Okay. That's very different to make that. That's very important to make that difference. So in the civil court, you judge the tort with the civil code. The plaintiff has to prove by a preponderance of evidence or a burden of proof that he or she was wronged, and the jury has to find the defendant at least 51% guilty. Okay. So as well as for the negligence, you have to make a difference between contributory and contributive fault. Now in a criminal court, you are judged for criminal acts, different code, the penal code, and then we have to prove that the defendant committed a crime beyond a reasonable doubt, which means that the jury has to find the person 100% guilty. Remember, on the other side, 51% guilty, here, with the criminal court, 100% guilty. That's a major difference, okay? If 90% of the jury thinks you are guilty, you are not guilty of that crime. Now let's talk precisely about assault and battery. So we will make the difference between intentional tort and criminal action here. The battery is an intentional, unpermitted, unprivileged, and offensive physical touching of another. You can be morally touched, that's not a battery. Of course, there is one exception or privilege, which is the self-defense or defense of a third person. The elements which needs to be proven are the intent to touch the plaintiff, the actual touching occurred, and a lack of consent by the plaintiff. By the way, that's why it is very hard right now to show evidence of a battery in hockey. It's almost impossible to prove a battery in hockey because now the court ruled that in hockey people agree by the fact that they are playing hockey. So be really careful about the lack of consent by the plaintiff. The defense for the battery are the contact was not intentional, then it becomes a negligence, as you imagine. The plaintiff consented to be touching. That's the example of the hockey that I just mentioned. And it's rarely possible to deny the touching in sport, so it's usually not a defense. Now an assault. Very hard for me, by the way, to pronounce that word without saying something horrible. The assault. So it's the threat of a battery, the threat only, okay? The threat of harmful or offensive touching, if you prefer. The element that you have to prove to show that there was an assault is that the defendant attended to cause harm, there was an apprehension. The plaintiff felt a reasonable apprehension of immediate harm. You can say that, oh, I was afraid that in 6 months something would happen. Doesn't work. Okay, it has to be a physical, the fear of a physical harm and a reasonable apprehension to that immediate harm. And, of course, the lack of consent by the plaintiff. Again, if you play hockey, that doesn't work. Defense of assault is one of the 3 elements is missing. Only one of the 3 elements is missing. Then you show that there is no assault. If there was consent, no assault. If the harm wasn't immediate, no assault. If the defendant didn't attend to cause harm, then there wasn't an assault because it was just a negligence. Now, are they intentional tort or crimes, those batteries and assault? In many cases, they can be either or both, okay? And actually, it's gonna depend on the states also. So that's not easy to find a strict rule there. But it's important to mention that the prosecutors rarely view athletes as real criminals. You can look in your textbook for a little reading about that if you want. And an organization can be held liable if an employee threatens to harm another. So as a risk manager or as a manager in general, be very careful about that. Think about vicarious liability for your organization, okay? So, tort or crime, basically, as you can see with that little table, it's gonna depend on the states for the assault, but you need to make a difference between simple battery or simple assault and aggravated assault or battery, okay? In the case of a crime, the simple battery is a misdemeanor or a tort, but an aggravated battery, for example, if you use a deadly weapon like a stick, for example, in hockey, then if you kill somebody, that's another problem. Then it's a felony, not a misdemeanor anymore. It's a felony, okay? So be really careful. Now let's talk a little bit about defamation. The elements which have to be proven to prove that there was a defamation are there was a false and defamatory statement of the facts. They were published to a third party. If it wasn't published, there was no defamation, okay? I can insult you if nobody blogs about it, or if it does, then we consider it doesn't harm your reputation. Third element, fault or negligence of the speaker or the writer, and it causes injury or most often damages, mostly damage of your reputation. So 2 types of defamation. If that's a written defamation, is called libel defamation, oral defamation, slander defamation. In the case, for example, of Mike Leach versus Texas Tech, Mike Leach accused Texas Tech of libel and slander defamation. So you can have both. If you write something which could harm the reputation of somebody and also you talk about it and it's published, then it becomes libel and slander, okay? Now, there is 2 types of people that you need to consider. Either the person is a public figure and then you need to prove an actual malice, so that's a tough part, okay? You have to show that the speaker or writer knew that the statement was false. If you are a private figure, it's a little bit easier because you simply have to show that the speaker or the writer failed to exercise reasonable care. Basically, if you're private, you have to show that it was a negligence. If the figure is public, you have to prove that the person knew that the statement was false. Okay, so there was a very strong intent to damage your career, for example. Thank you, that's all for now.